All
Word.
right, awesome.
Good to be with you all.
Likewise. I am very sorry. I've got one of those names in real life, but I don't want to say it until I hear you say it.
I
How am I supposed to
appreciate
pronounce your
that.
name?
Shahid Buttar.
Shahid Buttar.
Just like that.
Oh, awesome. All right, I think I'll be the last time I say that. I don't want to mess it up. So,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
so for everyone here, Shahid Buttar. I still get it right?
You nailed it.
Okay, awesome. Uh, he's running, and I believe is it California 12?
Yep, that's right.
California 12 against Nancy Pelosi, right?
Indeed.
All right, so that's pretty big. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your main policy priorities?
Yeah, I'm an immigrant. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm an artist. I've come to this race having worked for the last 5 years at EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. My career before that was focused at a range of other nonprofits on issues from fighting the right wing takeover of our courts to fighting the FBI's infiltration of Quaker and animal rights activist groups to advancing. I was one of the first courtroom advocates for marriage equality in the country in the early 2000s. And that same role gave me a chance to fight campaign finance reform for campaign finance reform. So had an opportunity over that time to do a bunch of things in the policy sphere. I also, in the context of my work as an advocate, have briefed members of Congress at their invitation. I've been arrested in the US Senate for an act of journalism. I'm also a direct action organizer and have participated in the siege of San Francisco when Bush invaded Iraq, helped shut down a Lockheed Martin uh, facility for a day a few months after the invasion. Back in 2003, I founded Politicized Performance Arts Collective that have been active for the better part of 15 years in 3 different cities. Bunch of random things. So yeah, I've gone where I'm needed and tried to do what I can to be helpful over the last 20 years. And I'm in my third year of the quest to liberate San Francisco's voice in Congress. And did you ask me about the issues that I'm running on as well?
Yeah, could you just tell? I mean, I
Yeah.
guess the main three things for you.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to reduce it to three, but if I were to pick three, one of them is defunding police and investing in alternatives to them. Another one is establishing a universal right to health care. And the third is securing climate justice. There are a bunch of other planks in the platform. And just if I can to neatly summarize them, I'm a democratic socialist, particularly committed to anti authoritarian ideals informed by my immigrant experience. I have a particularly post colonial vision of democratic socialism. And I'm grateful for the chance to offer it to our body politic, and I'm eager to take that voice to Congress.
All right, so I think a lot of people. I remember. So, I mean, this obviously isn't about me; it's about you. But in 2012, I went to. I was a freshman in college, and I heard about decolonization, and it was a brand new word to me. So I'm sure a lot of people aren't familiar with that concept. What do you mean when you say that? You said it was. I'm sorry. Um, I lost the word here, but you said you're an advocate for.
Post-colonial? Was
Yeah.
that was that the word that tripped you up? Post-colonial liberation? That might have been the
Yes. I'm
thing.
sorry.
Yeah.
Post-colonial liberation. What does that mean?
Right. You think of it as an internationalism. We're living through, a lot of people observe, for instance, just to use a concrete example, the fact that when the pandemic hit, we didn't have any personal protective equipment and we had no manufacturing capacity in the United States to craft it, precisely because we have basically offshored all of our manufacturing capacity, except for what prison slave labor we have available, which is frankly more or less what remains of manufacturing capacity in the United States. And that's a result of corporate globalization. I'm a globalist of a different sort. There was an era in the United States, particularly the era of the Second World War and its immediate aftermath, when we advanced international human rights principles. We sent a justice of the Supreme Court to prosecute the trial at Nuremberg that stood for the principle that if you facilitate or authorize or condone or enable or actually torture someone, any of those things, it's a crime, full stop. Doesn't matter if there's a ticking time bomb, doesn't matter if somebody gave you an order, doesn't matter if you think it needed to happen. Torture equals crime, full stop, around the world. Fast forward, we now have a Supreme Court justice who is a torturer. and an enabler of it. That was what Kavanaugh did when he served in the Bush Justice Department before being appointed to the D.C. Circuit in 2006. And I had a chance to fight his nomination then, a decade before most Americans came to be aware of his name and the threat that he and his ilk posed to the rule of law. Post-colonialism is a recognition that in the same way that international issues impact we, the people of the United States, similarly, we, the people of the United States, impact the international sphere, and our impact could be one that is oppressive and leaves people dead and exacerbating a global climate crisis, or it can be one that respects human dignity, that respects the future, and that places those values in a paramount position to capital. And again, that's exactly what we haven't done. Nancy Pelosi is a big part of that commitment to the existing paradigm. And I'm eager to help usher in a new future that is not committed to those kinds of predacious, opportunistic, rent seeking behavior of capital, but instead one that is committed to, particularly in the international sphere, advancing international human rights. Let me locate this in a different concrete example as well. There are many industrialized countries around the world, dozens of them. We are the only one among them where healthcare is not acknowledged as a human right. And it's remarkable to me that we in the United States tolerate not having the same rights as everyone else in the entire industrialized world. And even if it weren't the viciousness of for-profit healthcare, even if it weren't the stupidity of allocating access to a shared public good as if it were a commodity, which undermines public health and drives up the cost, all the things that we've seen characterize the American healthcare system. Just the sheer fact that we are not proud enough to demand the same rights as people in other countries, it makes me smirk a little bit. I often say that when we sing anthems at baseball games about living in a land of the free and the home of the brave, that we're neither. And I usually locate that critique in surveillance and the threat it poses to conscience and how we're not as free as we might think. And obviously, the policing issues make that pretty obvious. We're not nearly as free as many people might think. But we're also not nearly as brave as many people might think, because if we were brave, we would have universal health care in this country and we wouldn't be getting fleeced by corporate Democrats for the last 30 years.
All right. So I'm just gonna jump into some users' questions here. Lil
Yeah.
Bill wants to know, are you in favor of a permanent UBI, and if so, in what form?
So certainly an emergency UBI responding to this crisis, and I'd love to see a permanent one. I'm particularly eager to see a UBI be U, which is to say universal, not means tested, and to be basic, which is to say layered on top of all of the other social services to which people currently have access. And those two principles, I think, define a UBI that is in line with Martin Luther King's vision, a UBI that is, again, liberatory, and I think about UBI in a post-colonial sense. If you think about the wealth of this country having been accreted through basically neo-imperial plunder, and that's a not unfair way to characterize it, a UBI program is a way of distributing that back to people. Um, I could particularly see a UBI passed as an emergency measure responding to the pandemic and the very unique challenges that people are confronting at this moment as a compelling opportunity politically to establish the policy. And I would love to see it become a permanent fixture of our body politic. I would much rather see our resources channeled to people and our needs than particularly the military industrial complex. So the funding for everything, frankly, from Medicare for All to the Green New Deal to a UBI, I think we have plenty of money for it. It's both from the existing expenditures on the Pentagon and everything we would spend on it if we didn't make those choices otherwise. It's not unlike defunding the police. When we talk about defunding police, ultimately what we are talking about is enabling alternative investments and more effective strategies to ensure public safety, like hiring counselors and social workers and returning citizens who are reintegrating into their communities, who can be disarmed, have street cred, can operate as nonviolent de-escalators in otherwise tense settings. We have better ways than arming people to the teeth, training them to kill, and then sending them out into our communities to serve our community's needs. The same thing is true in the international context. Um, Hopefully that gets a little bit at the question.
Yeah. Next question we have is from, let's see here, Math Yoda. He wants to know, what is something that you like about the modern right wing?
What is something I like about the modern right wing?
Yeah. Hard hitting, tough questions.
God, that's gonna. I mean, we might be here all day.
Just too many things to think of.
I mean, I'm trying. I suppose you could say they go to bat for free speech principles, but I'm digging pretty deep here. I mean, yeah. Um, they haven't murdered us all yet, I suppose, but I'm pretty sure they want to if they get a chance.
All right. Let's see
I mean,
here.
yeah, I don't have a lot to say in response to that question. I appreciate it, but yeah, I'm not a friend of that community so much. Well, I could say that the modern right wing has come out to challenge the surveillance state. I mean, that's legit. We could say that. I mean, it depends on who you're talking about, right wing, because the right wing and the left wing, unfortunately, just break down a lot when you look at them closely enough to
Hmm.
note distinctions. But there are voices among the right wing who have declared themselves, particularly the libertarian side of the conservative wing, that have declared themselves opposed to government surveillance. I wouldn't call them right wing, though, because libertarians and the right wing, I think of the right wing as much more fascist than libertarian. So maybe we're quibbling over terms here, but yeah, that's about the best I can do there.
Okay. Um, so let's see. I'd like to know, actually, I wrote this one down. What's wrong with Pelosi?
Pelosi is the leader of the Democratic Party who does everything she can to enable Republican policies and enable a criminal president. And I can make this case 10 different ways. I saw it straight out of the gate when she first became the Speaker of the current Congress, when she imposed the pay go rules. So, the pay as you go rules, this was a fiscal austerity measure, basically an accounting trick imposed by Republicans that Democrats always fought in the 90s, that Nancy Pelosi, as the leader of the Democrats, imposed in 20, it would have been 19. And it is odd that in 2019, the head of the Democrats is imposing a policy that Republicans favored in the 90s. And it's a policy that particularly imposes fiscal austerity by requiring that any social spending on things like healthcare or food stamps or housing be offset by corresponding spending cuts to other programs or tax increases. And just to be clear, this is exactly what we don't do for anything in the military appropriation bucket. If we want to spend $2.5 trillion on a fighter jet that can't meet our actual security needs, and just to be clear, we have real national security crises. They include a pandemic, they include climate chaos, they include the need to keep the post office open, to let an election happen by mail if we need to. None of those things does a fighter plane help. And we can spend $2.5 trillion on an obsolete, corrupt, fraudulent, wasteful fighter jet program, and there's no need to offset that with tax increases or spending cuts. We just end up indenturing the future to pay that back. And that's exactly what, frankly, government spending generally is, but we disproportionately discriminate against social spending because of this rule that Nancy Pelosi imposed, just to be clear there. There's much more to that than this. Nancy Pelosi is one of the things that particularly infuriates me and drove me to run for the seat is that she is part of a continuing, at least now into its 15th year, cover up over CIA torture. And just to riff on the agency, she at one point was in an oversight capacity over the intelligence community. And there has never been a set of intelligence community abuses to which Nancy Pelosi has not deferred and, in fact, actively supported. She is an architect of the mass surveillance regime that I've dedicated the last decade of my life to fighting. She is an enabler, again, of CIA torture. Rewinding the clock on the CIA, it's particularly poignant to consider the role of the agency in the central controversy gripping our republic at the moment. People are very growing aware of how much Black Lives Matter and how much the legal system has disregarded that commitment. I think many people who maybe haven't been subjected to arbitrary police violence and abuses are coming to recognize just how bad it is, seeing whether it's the images on social media of too many people gunned down who are innocent, or whether it's the militarized response to peaceful dissent by our neighbors defending each other from armed state predators in our communities. And across these instances, even many of the people in the streets and even many of our leaders in the movement don't necessarily pin the tail on the donkey. And that is an agency that for decades, 70 years around the country, has been assaulting democracy and human rights. And there is a particular era when the CIA ran crack cocaine into US cities to fund its rogue foreign policy and human rights abuses across Latin America, particularly in Nicaragua. One of the things that happened then is that US police started dying on US streets at the hands of narco traffickers who the CIA trained, funded, and equipped. And two of the things that happened as a result of that is that our police grew militarized and we embraced mass incarceration. And that was 30 years ago. That all happened with the support of Democrats. And the agency never paid a price, either in its budget or its powers. And as a result of the creation of this underground economy that the CIA created, we sent 2.5 million Americans, black and brown Americans, into prison where they are now legally enslaved and exploited for their free labor. And that's a gruesome but entirely too accurate and disturbing reflection and perspective on mass incarceration. I think people look at mass incarceration as an aspect and a reflection of brutality. They might think about it as a reflection of an insufficient commitment to human rights. They might think of it as our resources being co-opted for systematic murder with impunity. But I think people rarely recognize its role as both a cause and an effect of institutional corruption, contriving basically the replication of slavery in the United States. And for anybody to whom that's a new analysis, I'd invite you particularly to check out Michelle Alexander's work. Ava DuVernay has also done some really powerful public education on these issues. And I think that these issues need to have some reflection in our national policymaking body. At the moment, it's very hard to find a member of Congress willing to challenge the prison industrial complex or the military industrial complex. And both of them they have a great deal of similarity. And they're among the central threats to the Republic. And Nancy Pelosi's been complicit in creating both of them. You asked me what's wrong with Pelosi. I'll riff on this in a different direction. Housing here in San Francisco is a real issue. It confronts and challenges everybody. Even very well-resourced people in San Francisco are challenged by the cost of housing here. And there's an affordable housing crisis in cities across the country. And I wonder if it might be different if the leader of the Democratic Party were not herself a wealthy landlord inclined to protect her class interests. Nancy Pelosi is worth over $100 million. She owns many, many properties, and she makes $1 million a year in income in rent. And I am a renter. If you put me in Congress, I am going to be supporting the bills that Nancy Pelosi doesn't, namely Ilhan Omar's bill to cancel rents and mortgages and provide support for small landlords during the period of the pandemic. And around the country, millions of Americans are wondering, how am I going to stay in my home? And here in California, thankfully, we have a state moratorium on evictions, but back payments are continuing to accrue. And in many other states, there's no even support to that extent. And the idea that Nancy Pelosi is going to give 43,000 millionaires a tax break of $1.5 million each in the middle of a pandemic without supporting the bill to keep people in their homes, to me, just exposes on whose behalf she legislates. She has a vaunted reputation as a master legislator. I will concede that it is deserved. And I would just note on whose behalf her mastery is deployed. And the answer is not we, the people of the United States. It's not we, the people of San Francisco. It has been capital and the corporations of Wall Street. And that is an unacceptable answer, especially at a time like this.
Wow, that's pretty heavy. I I just gotta say I really appreciate. I can see your genuine passion and why you're running with that. But just to light things up a little bit, what's
Hmm.
your drink of choice?
um, yeah, I'm partial to. I'm kind of like a habitual hot chocolate drinker, and when I'm left to my own devices, I might put a splash of Bailey's in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So next up, we've got a question here from Alexander, which he'd like to ask himself on automation. Alexander, are you there? Alexander? All right. We'll move on then.
I see his name in the group, but yeah.
Yeah, he's just I think AFK at the moment. So um, let's see. Dog writes that he heard you mention mass surveillance, and recently the House of Representatives entered in the conference over a Senate bill to authorize or reauthorize FISA. Um, he wants to know what would you do about FISA?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is literally the reason I'm running for Congress. was I was at EFF. I watched the last reauthorization. It's actually Patriot, not Pfizer, but they are a helix. They reauthorize each other. And it was watching Pelosi undermine surveillance reform that caused me, in a moment of passion, without frankly meaning it, I said, "F this ish. This makes me want to quit my job and run against her." And of course, you don't mean something like that. And everybody in the room was like, "I'd vote for you." And frankly, it rattled me. And then, 3 weeks later, I found myself like running for the seat. And the fixes for FISA start with a warrant requirement. It's not novel. It's in the Constitution, and we have disregarded it up and down the block. Just simply requiring an independent arbiter, a judge, to sign off on a surveillance application would fix the problem to a large extent, because that would put somebody between arbitrary executive branch corruption and bulk collection from the American people. So other things we need to do, including particularly ensuring that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is meaningfully transparent, and that the decisions from one context to the next can be reported. At the moment, the court is not actually a court because there's no precedence that gets set by it. A court, as distinguished from a political body, is supposed to ascertain questions of law that set precedent. You can't set a precedent if the decisions are secret. And so the decisions of the FISA court at least need to be transparent to the extent they can be, while obfuscating whatever operational details need to remain secret. That's one piece. We've seen recent reforms that enable the FISA court to have access to independent counsel to inform its decisions. Those should be mandatory provisions. There's a whole range of transparency and oversight provisions here. Many of them stretch outside Patriot and FISA. The top of my list is classification reform. There is a hole in our bucket. It's called a hole in the bucket of our democracy, pardon me. And it is executive secrecy. Through the gaping chasm of executive secrets emerge any number of, frankly, horrifying violations of our most fundamental commitments. There have been 3, possibly 4 right-wing coups in Latin America in the last year alone: Brazil, Bolivia, and 2 in Venezuela. All of them fit a long-standing pattern, again, implicating the CIA. Does anybody know what the CIA's involvement in any of those events are? No one has any idea. The CIA did invite the dictator in Brazil, who's waging an ecocide in the Amazon, to come speak at the CIA headquarters. I might ask you, what does that suggest to you? Just given that the CIA doesn't often invite heads of state. In fact, he might be the first head of state ever invited to speak in Langley, Virginia. I find that curious. And, this will dovetail. You asked me a while ago, what's wrong with Nancy Pelosi? There is a figure in Congress who, as the Speaker of the House, effectively unilaterally sets the House rules. It is by her edict, unilaterally, that every member of Congress is denied a staff member with security clearance able to see behind the wall of executive secrecy. So there's just a handful of people in the House, all handpicked by her, and they are the only ones with any independent capacity to oversee executive branch intelligence agencies. And that is a structural failure of the branch and a structural complicity by the Speaker. So one of the things I want to do for surveillance and FISA is just to knock the Speaker out of the way so that Congress can once again exercise effective oversight. A lot of people might describe Pelosi, particularly like her, center right apologists. Oh, she's a liberal. She's doing the best she can in a conservative Congress, and it's not true. And this role with respect to denying members of Congress staff with security clearance is among the best reflections of it I could find, because she is very actively here an executive maximalist, and allowing executive secrecy precludes not only congressional oversight of intelligence functions, it precludes legitimacy in congressional legislation. This is the story of the Patriot Act and FISA. Why do we have such harebrained, stupid acts of legislation moving through Congress? Because there hasn't been any oversight and no one has any facts. And every time Congress thinks about this, every 6 years on the eve of a power expiring, a parade of intelligence officials come before Congress saying, you have to reauthorize this or we're all going to die. And then they sign the bill, and then we're, 60 years later, we have the exact same charade. And, just to be explicit about this, all of these measures, whether it's Patriot, FISA, whether it's the intelligence operations through NSA, FBI, ICE, CBP, DHS, the ODNI, like every one of these agencies is duplicative and wasteful and fraudulent. Even if we, thought about there being some legitimate purpose to surveillance, it hasn't actually been achieved because none of these things have been security promoting. And they're particularly not match to the rationale now. If they tell us that we're all going to die, there's a news flash. There is a thing that is killing Americans by the hundreds of thousands, and a surveillance network doesn't do anything to address it. And every time we have a mass shooting in this country, it's proof to me that the surveillance apparatus is useless as an object of security protection. It's great for security theater. It's great for lining the pockets of corporate contractors. Security, not so much. And particularly when you think about the impact of that security theater on the right to conscience and expression, the reason I'm concerned about these security theater measures is because they intimidate and silence people, particularly vulnerable people. If you're gay in the South, or if you're, I don't know, maybe a right winger in San Francisco, you might be less able to raise your voice. You might feel less free to raise your voice. And one of the reasons that we've historically had restrictions on things like government surveillance, even when the technology was less invasive, we had stronger legal protections because we recognize how important it is in a democracy that people have a chance to speak their mind safely and without being intimidated. And here's the crux. When your neighbor feels silenced, they're not the only ones harmed. We are all harmed when anyone silences themselves, because in a democracy, we need everyone's voice, which is to say it's our democracy that surveillance kills by intimidating participants in it. And that's not a hypothetical fear. That is documented fact in history. Surveillance for national security purposes in the United States has always been politicized for over 100 years. The very first acts of the FBI were rounding up trade unionists, labor organizers, and deporting them. That was the Palmer raid. And, the COINTELPRO era was 50 years of this, much more vicious examples than that, murdering Black Power, civil rights leaders in their beds. In fact, I pulled out a book by, Fred Hampton, the book about the murder of Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was a Black Power leader in his early 20s, killed in his bed at 4 o'clock in the morning without charge, without trial. He was feeding kids. That was what his crime was. And now I'm just rambling and chasing a rabbit. I don't even remember where we started, but I hope that answers whatever the question is. Thanks for bearing with me. I get riled up,
What's wrong with Nancy Pelosi, I think.
That was a couple questions ago, wasn't it? But I could go on all day about that together.
But let's see. Please do feel free to ramble. The whole point here is to get what's on your heart, so that tends to happen.
Careful what you wish for.
Jet would like to know, what are your thoughts on police reform and defunding the police?
Yeah, word. Police reform is what we were asking for 20 years ago. Defunding police is what we are demanding now in the wake of a recognition that the paradigm has failed, period. Predatory, paramilitarized policing and prisons, at least in this sort of punitive model that we've constructed, they just don't work. They don't work to enhance public safety. They don't deter crime. They don't prevent crime. In fact, they encourage crime by breeding and hardened criminals. If we are serious about public safety, and that's the supposed goal of the policing apparatus, we should examine what works and invest in the things that work to actually promote public safety. They include nonviolent de-escalators. We've seen that work around the world. And we've also seen pilot programs of that sort across the country. We've also seen programs here in San Francisco, actually, just last week. Don't often have the occasion to be proud of our mayor, but she did recently announce that the SFPD is no longer going to be tasked with responding to reports of, for instance, non-criminal nuisance violations, like someone maybe who is unhoused on someone's block. The police aren't going to be involved in those responses anymore. That's a huge step forward. Social workers, teachers, counselors can do what police have failed to do, and that is de-escalate situations to keep people safe. Anybody who's seen any of the videos of any of the incidents that we've all seen can recognize the way that police are not de-escalators. And that's what the mission should be. At the moment, we train police as paramilitaries, and there's a whole sordid cycle here. I haven't written about this at great length, but I have a song, Ferguson in Jerusalem, that sort of unpacks what I describe as international human rights abuse laundering by the US. We send tax dollars to Israel to innovate new forms of crowd suppression and then import those tactics and training into US cities that we paramilitarily occupy. And it doesn't make a great deal of sense that we are allowing our police to be trained in counterinsurgency tactics. What we are witnessing in all these videos is the predictable response of that. We should learn a couple of things there. One is not only how illegitimate is the use of those counterinsurgency tactics in U.S. streets, but also how illegitimate is their use anywhere, at least in countries that our military supplies and gives aid to. I'm very eager to see connected to police reform an end of U.S. support and aid to any country that abuses human rights. And the two leading human rights abusers among the beneficiaries of U.S. aid at the moment are Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I'd like to see both of them, frankly, cut off until they respect human rights. Just coming back to domestic policing, the militarization of police, which is what I'm biting off here, is an inextricable part of the current problem. And a lot of people will say, oh, we have to train cops better. Like, yes, sure. And we have to take money away from the departments and invest in the people who will do better jobs of keeping us safe. Now, there's a whole other thing I've heard people say with respect to this, like, what are you going to do about the things we need cops for, like bank robberies and rapes? If you talk to any survivor of sexual assault, they will tell you about the campaigns in cities around the country to try to get police to show up for work and actually process rape kits. They don't actually do the core thing that people think they do. And the biggest problem here, frankly, I think, is Hollywood, because for decades, Hollywood has been churning out cop dramas that frankly contrive false senses of insecurity in people who watch them in a country that certainly relative to our historical baseline is quite safe. And if we're really concerned about preventing crime, the most important thing we could do to stop and address crime is to more equitably distribute our resources so that people don't feel compelled to engage in criminal activity due to desperation. I think these are all different intersectional ways to carve out the problem. I think of defunding the police as an imperative. I think of limiting their powers as an imperative. I think of investing in alternatives like restorative justice, like nonviolent conflict resolution opportunities. Those are imperatives. And all of these are of a piece. One other thing I'll just say, they're the fastest thing we can do, the thing that I think there's already a bipartisan, transpartisan consensus to do, that I think we could do like day one, once I replace Pelosi, is remove cannabis from the Federal Controlled Substances Act. In California, we have the fortune, and in many states around the country, of having legal access to cannabis. And many states also have, medical cannabis available short of a full decriminalization or recreational scheme. In states, though, where it remains illegal, it's still a pretext for cops to harass, beat up, detain, arrest, and charge and incarcerate, particularly low-income youth of color, Black and brown kids. And that's within the federal government's control. One of the biggest challenges in the criminal justice arena is that so much of criminal justice is effectuated at the local and state level, so Congress has only indirect influence. But this is one thing that's very much squarely within the federal government's domain. And the Federal Controlled Substances Act should not include things that people take to shift their mind state. Those don't impact anybody else. They don't have third-party harms. There's no philosophical basis for criminalization. I dare say that it represents a locus not unlike surveillance, not unlike mass incarceration or torture with impunity. It's a locus of authoritarianism, the presumption that we have the right to dictate what people put in their own bodies. It's the same way that, the presumption of the right to dictate how people control their own bodies in the reproductive context. I'm very committed to reproductive liberty for the same reason I'm very committed to cognitive liberty. And I think of that as also connected very much to the movement to defund police and invest in better alternatives to secure public safety.
All right. Next question here comes from Charlie. He wants to know, what do you think about Marx?
When I read Karl Marx, I remember being disappointed because I was like, okay, somebody figured this out already. And it uncovered layers. I think his depiction of history in particular is very poignant. People think about Marx as prescriptive. He's primarily descriptive, right? I mean, Marx just attempted to describe and explain a set of historical phenomena, recurring patterns. And his analysis, frankly, fits. I mean, when we test for scientific validity in the scientific method, you sort of like test a hypothesis with the way it fits observed results. And his analysis of historiography and the dialectic, it certainly crafts a shoe that fits the feet of our civilization. And I do particularly believe that there's a great deal of historical intergenerational poignance in the reminder that the resources of our society and the accumulated resources of our generations could be either shared equitably and commonly owned, or they could, as they are currently, be hoarded and lorded over the rest of us. And I think that, implicit in his historiography is an invitation to reclaim our future and an invitation to equity and an opportunity to share the resources that for entirely too long in our species history have been hoarded. And I think particularly of the way that I'm straying off Marx here, but just to talk about capitalism, I see the way that capitalism intersects with, we've talked about militarism, and just to take an example here, like think about the ecocide in Brazil as an example of U.S. international militarism remixed with the capitalism that drives the industrial interest in promoting these coups, right? That when the CIA is intervening in Chile in 1973, for instance, or perhaps Bolivia in 2018, it's not just because they want to. There are usually industrial interests driving those interventions. So that is the intersection of capitalism and militarism. And when I think about Marx, he didn't necessarily. I think it was others inspired by him who more granularly developed the theory of imperialism and the theory of resource extraction by imperial centers from the periphery. I come from a land that was colonized for 400 years by the same country that colonized this one. And I've seen in not the very distant past, I mean, not in my lifetime, about 30 years before I was born, South Asia was liberated from British rule, and I live proudly in the country that rejected British rule, 150 years before that. And as a country that itself was born of an act of anti-colonial resistance, I want to see our commitment to anti-colonialism continue, even when it is Pax Americana, our American empire, against which the rest of the world is called to rebel. And uh, for better or worse, between the pandemic and climate chaos, I don't think Pax Americana is sustainable anyway. Like we can't possibly maintain the level of spending required to project the influence we do around the world. If they tell us we don't have Medicare for all, and we certainly do, you just see that corporate Democrats and Republicans have other ways they would rather spend that money, instruments of destruction instead of healthcare. I keep doing this where I distract myself and I forget what the question was that we started on. But
Karl Marx.
right, yeah, I think he laid out a schema that certainly explains a great deal. If I can tell an anecdote here, so in 1999, 99, I think it was 99 when I got the letter. I applied for security clearance to work in the State Department. I think it was 97. Passed the written Foreign Service exam, passed the oral exam. I ended up getting denied security clearance in 1999, and the stated reason was that I had smoked marijuana in the past. As someone who is both Muslim and also had, at the point earlier in my academic history, studied Marx, I've come to describe that as the 3M theory of security clearance, between being a Muslim who had read Marx and smoked marijuana. Those that together was disqualifying to the State Department at the time, and I'm proud of each of those things.
The M theory. All right, so next question here. Little Bill wants to know, what are your thoughts on Julian Assange?
Julian is a whistleblower like many others. I wish that he had gotten due process. I hope very much that there is an opportunity for his rights and interests to be vindicated. A lot of people's attitudes towards him shifted as the political interests exposed by the transparency that he promoted shifted. There was a time when WikiLeaks was revealing the evidence of U.S. military cover-ups of assassinations of foreign journalists by the U.S. military, and that was a thing that's the collateral murder video. That's the thing that Chelsea Manning went to prison for revealing. And later, WikiLeaks revealed other things that, cut a very different way in our body politic. Regardless of how you feel about the interests implicated by WikiLeaks disclosures, I do think very much that agents of transparency deserve our protection. That's why we have a freedom of the press. And it's a principle worth our defense, not just for the sake of those journalists, but in the same way that surveillance offends our democracy by inhibiting people, the right of the press preserves our democracy by enabling truth tellers to do their jobs. And it's critical that we defend their rights, not just for their sake, but for our own sake, because if we don't protect their rights, we will all end up in the dark because there won't be anyone to tell us the truth at a time when our government we know is already lying to us. And I think it's really important that we vindicate, if not due process principles, if not the interests of whistleblowers, at least our own interest in democratic transparency. this gets back a little bit to my whole anti-colonial, post-colonial view. I see the interests and this connects to the discussion of executive secrecy. I see executive secrecy as basically an extension of imperial interests. It is the attempt to keep secret from we the people, to whom our government is answerable. It answers to us in theory if we know what it's doing. But if we don't know what our agencies are doing, the whole democratic compact falls apart, right? It's not a democracy in that case. And I would invite people to wonder, like, how much a democracy are we? If you rewind the tape over the last 70 years, I think of our campaign, I think of our movement well beyond our campaign. I think of this political moment as a democratization struggle of a country that claims freedom without understanding entirely what it means. And I see these as vital principles that we absolutely must fight for and reclaim, because frankly, there's too much at stake for us not to.
All right. Uh, Next question: is America an imperialist nation? And if so, is it more so or less so than in the past?
Huh. Well, the past begs which past, and when people talk about this president as the worst president ever, I always think about Andrew Jackson and the scale of devastation and misery that he wrought was at least even more vast than that of our current president. I'm not in any way making an excuse for Donald Trump, just to make that clear. Um, but to compare our abusiveness over time, I do have a hard time thinking what we have done recently that is as genocidal as the westward expansion. Which is to say that, maybe there's been some progress, one hopes. I do absolutely think we're an imperial nation. I think that's demonstrated, particularly in this litany of CIA interventions that, seems to be continuing with the complicity of Congress led by Nancy Pelosi. Um, and I think of imperialism as inherent in the project of resource extraction. And if you think about CIA interventions through the lens of which oil company or which fruit company, people are familiar with the brand Chiquita Banana. That used to be the United Fruit Company. It's because of the United Fruit Company's lobbying that the CIA invaded something like a dozen countries across Latin America, from the 50s through the 70s. And these are reflections of imperialism. The executive secrecy we talked about is a reflection of imperialism. Paramilitary police reacting violently to suppress dissent within the United States is an example of imperialism turning its fangs from the international markets that it's been exploiting to then exploit American markets, and the perspective of US civilian populations as markets for the military industrial policing complex to exploit, I think is just a further reflection of how that imperialism doesn't just any longer affect people around the world. In fact, it never did. It always affected Americans too. But I think the effect on Americans is becoming increasingly inescapable.
All right. Let's see. Next question we've got here is from Dutchman. He wants to know, what do you think about the right to bear arms and stand your ground laws?
Good questions. Y'all are rigorous. So stand your ground laws, I think, are ridiculous. I mean, they justify the escalation. People will remember that that was the law that was cited by George Zimmerman to get off when he murdered Trayvon Martin, and he was doing anything but standing his ground, right? I mean, George Zimmerman basically chased this poor man, this poor young man, this poor boy across his neighborhood and ended up murdering him. And there's nothing about it that was standing your ground. So you could think of standing your ground laws as enabling wanton murder. It's one among many laws pushed by the American Legislative Exchange Council, and I'm immediately suspect of anything that comes out of that body. As to the Second Amendment right, I appreciate this because this is a chance I'll ramble here for a minute. So I wrote an article fall 2015, maybe 2016. It's called Ferguson and the Second Amendment. It would have been in August. I just remember I remember writing it before I went and then finding it published when I came back from Burning Man. So I know it was in August. I don't remember what year, but the piece assesses particularly the way that the historical basis for the Second Amendment shifted over time. And it's often been the case that shifts over time in our cultural fabric, technology, what have you, have implications for the Constitution. Think about the emergence of the internet and the tensions it creates in the First Amendment as an example of that. Think about the right to record police implicit in the First Amendment and how it survives the emergence of cell phones, which then create these novel contexts of tension between long established norms, right? In the Second Amendment context, the key historical innovation, we've talked about this, just in the last half hour, the militarization of police, that very same historical phenomenon when I was talking about the CIA running crack into US cities, and then our state and local governments responding with the federal government support, with Nancy Pelosi support, by hyper militarizing our police instead of doing anything about the CIA, which had contrived that domestic market. In Hold on, I'm just trying to grip the arc I was tracing there. We talked about the imperialism question before. Just give me the last
Right.
question again, if you
The
would.
question was about right to bear arms, and you were talking about
Yes,
the
thank you.
CIA and
Right. The
uh,
militarization piece. You can see how these issues intersect, and so it's hard when I get to the intersection of knowing like which out of which way of the roundabout was I going. So this militarization of police has constitutional implications. The reason we have a right to bear arms in the Second Amendment is so that we can meaningfully resist tyranny if it comes to pass. It was intended as the escape hatch. Think of it in context. The Second Amendment comes after 5 different rights are elucidated in the First. The First Amendment includes a right to conscience, a right to speak, a right to write, a right to assemble, and a right to petition. There's a professor at NYU Law School, Burton Newborn, who describes this as Madison's music, his Madison's attempt to protect a set of escalating opportunities to participate in a political process, right? The Second Amendment is what happens, what you're supposed to use if the First Amendment fails. If all else fails in the constitutional design and the government grows tyrannical, the people are supposed to reserve a right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia in order to resist, particularly the tyranny of a central state. The founders of our country were revolting from a monarchy. They were very conscious of the danger of a centralized state. The Federalist Papers, this is explicitly addressed up and down in many of the papers. And the Second Amendment's role in the constitutional design was quite explicit. It is a liberty-preserving escape hatch. And what closed it is not gun control laws. What closed it was when the CIA got away with murdering US cops, because what we did then after that was hyper-militarize our police, arm them to the teeth, and train them as warriors instead of guardians. And that is what closes the opportunity to connect a right to bear arms to meaningful resistance. That is to say, changes in history, they disconnected the text of the Second Amendment from its original purpose. So the right to bear arms no longer has a meaningful connection to liberty at all. I would say that in the contemporary context, if the Second Amendment means anything, it should be a right to exfiltrate government data, because that is actually meaningful resistance. It's meaningful resistance that's nonviolent, doesn't place people at harm, and the exfiltration of government data is a form of resistance to what, and certainly in the context of George Floyd's experience, emerges pretty clearly as government state tyranny. That is not established in the case law. I haven't heard anybody talk about that theory of a right to hacking grounded in the Second Amendment. I'm eager to do what I can to establish that. And in the meantime, particularly, this will riff on the question about Julian Assange, to defend the rights of whistleblowers in Congress. I am reminded particularly of Edward Snowden and the whistleblower who inspired him, Daniel Ellsberg. And for people who don't remember, when Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, it took principled members of Congress backing him up for that to work. If we didn't have Mike Gravel, who I'm proud to have his endorsement to replace Pelosi, if Mike Gravel were not a U.S. Senator when Daniel Ellsberg came forward, it's not clear that the Pentagon Papers ever gets released to the public, right? Whistleblowers need members of Congress willing to fight for transparency. That's what every member in the body swears an oath to do, is to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And most of them, frankly, I don't think they even understand the Constitution well enough to understand what they're swearing an oath to. And I understand it all too well, and I see how it's being shredded in every direction. And I see whistleblowers as conscientious public servants who give up their careers to do the right thing, and they deserve people to back them up. They deserve particularly people with the power of the pen and the power of asking tough questions to back them up. And having been arrested myself for asking questions, I'm very eager to protect other people who ask questions and other people who bring forth facts to disprove the lies of officials under oath. That's a particular pet peeve of mine, is our supposed public servants taking advantage of their powers and prerogatives. This fits with executive secrecy, but it becomes even more like sort of individual in terms of the dimension of the problem. But yeah, hopefully that gets a little bit at both how I feel about Assange, how I feel about whistleblowers. It connects back to the executive secrecy discussion that we were having earlier, and it connects to the Second Amendment.
Right. So I know we only got a few minutes left here. Try to squeeze in a couple more questions. We were mentioning just a minute ago about how you feel most people in Congress don't understand the Constitution they swear to uphold. How do you see the Constitution fitting in with hate speech laws?
The Constitution's fitting with hate speech laws. I
Yeah, how
mean,
does it
hate
fit
speech.
in? Does it
Yeah, I mean, the hate
does it
speech laws you
violate
could
free
think of.
speech?
Yeah, hate speech laws you could think of as carve outs from the First Amendment, and there are a lot of different views about this. I'm not auditioning to be a jurist, thankfully, because these are not the questions I particularly am interested in answering. But I am very eager to make sure and defend the opportunities for discourse in the public sphere and to defend the rights of minorities in policy. In policy, the way I think we do that is by making sure that to the extent we have restrictions on speech, that they're tightly circumscribed, particularly not to protect people's feelings, but to keep them safe. And we can think of examples of speech that is an incitement to violence. Our president is famed for that. And it's among the things, frankly, that I wish he were impeached for. And just riffing on your question before about, one of the things I think that's wrong with Nancy Pelosi is she didn't impeach Donald Trump for inciting violence that left dozens of Americans dead, or corruption that's filled his pocket with hundreds of millions of taxpayer funded dollars, or I could go on. But just on this piece about the, I think the hate speech laws recognize that speech itself can be criminal. And I can think of examples, whether, particular slurs come to mind that do replicate and leverage centuries of abuse. And, I think it's fully appropriate for that language, at the very least, not to be tolerated. And I think that, criminalization of anything I am not generally a fan of. So I would rather non-criminal restrictions, and I tend to favor norms as opposed to laws as restrictions on speech. Um, I don't think of that necessarily as it implicates the constitutional commitment to allowing speech, but it also implicates the reciprocal restriction, and that is the libertarian harm principle. Even in our, most libertarian constitutional tradition, the founders would say, if you stand up in a crowded space and you scream fire, that's not protected. Then there are analogs here when we talk about speech, particularly speech that marginalizes historically oppressed groups in ways that entrench and reinforce dominant power. And I think of that as either you could think about that as protecting the rights of the minority class community. You could think about that as restricting speech. You might even think about that as just guarding our democracy from white supremacy. And that is what I think distinguishes acceptable cases of restrictions, is the kind of restriction that preserves the polity from being destroyed from within. I hope that helps clarify sort of how those arenas intersect.
Yeah. So, last question we've got here. You know, is there anything on your mind today that we haven't touched on here?
Oh my God. Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, one of the, I'm a David confronting a Goliath. I'm an immigrant with no property. I don't own anything. I'm still paying back my student loans. I rent an apartment in Haight-Ashbury, and I'm confronting the most powerful corporate politician on the planet. And I'm doing it to try to keep your grandkids alive. And I'm going to need your help. We've got, thankfully, the support of over 20,000 Americans from across the country and thousands of volunteers. It's going to take that kind of support and, frankly, a lot more to liberate the seat. Just to give you some metrics on where we're at. So 2 months ago, I won 33,000 votes in this campaign, and it was enough to put us in the position to be the first Democrat to challenge Nancy Pelosi in a November election in the course of her 30 years in Congress. So we have a real chance to end her career, the best chance that we've had to end her career ever since she went into Congress. She hasn't debated anyone in 30 years. I'm very eager to have that debate, and I'm pretty confident that her record can't withstand an informed critique. If you're eager to see that debate yourselves, join us in trolling CNN and the San Francisco Chronicle and inviting that debate to happen. Sign up to volunteer with us. I think the link is in one of the channels. I'm not sure quite where to type it or if I can, but it's shahid.fyi/volunteer. You can also sign up on the website to make a donation if you're in a position to do that. We're just about to, or just did in the last week, or in the next week, will cross $1 million raised on our campaign. I'm incredibly grateful for that support. We've got a full-blown staff with half a dozen veterans from Bernie 2020. And we're looking forward to continuing the vindication of our movement's principles. And particularly while the presidential race, for me at least, doesn't offer a great many opportunities for excitement, our campaign still has the chance to score a massive victory for our movement to defend the future. And if we're successful in replacing Nancy Pelosi, not only will it be the biggest upset in US political history, but it will create an earthquake in Washington. We have a real opportunity to score a massive victory for the future. And I'm going to need all the support that we can get to make it happen. So I'd really invite anybody with us or any of your friends to join us on our website, shahidforchange.us, and sign up to volunteer. We'd love to work with you in liberating the seat.
All right. So for anyone listening again, those links, in case you didn't get a chance to write them down, those are all in announcements. How to volunteer remotely, how to donate, and also the Discord link. And if you guys are watching this on YouTube, they're going to be down in the description. Thank you, Shahid, for coming on. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the forum. And yeah, I hope to see you all online soon.
All right. Thanks. Have a good one.
Peace. You too.